Dr. Merlo, right? Yay! Starts with a DR. So yeah, he did his defense in December and successful. And I guess you're formally walking in February? Okay, that's exciting. So this has been a long road for him, and I think this is a major accomplishment for you, which I think is wonderful. We're blessed to have Dr. Merlo with us. As you know, he's also our campus minister, and he's been doing some tremendous work with the students, and also he is a pastoral associate, so he spends about half his time on campus ministry and the other half his time on pastoral associate work to work with our community, which I think is a wonderful opportunity. So we have, but Josh today is talking, I think, about at least a subset of some of your dissertation, right? On this term, a Leviathan, right? And talking about the all-powerful. How much power does an all-powerful God have? And I think that I'm very excited to hear what you have to say, Josh. So, Dr. Merlo.
Thank you, Mike. So, as Mike mentioned, I successfully defended my dissertation in December. For those of you who have known me for the couple of years that I've been here, I came to Buffalo as a doctoral student at the University at Buffalo, and so since I've been here for 8 years now, working on the dissertation, I thought I could share it with the community that has been with me for most of those 8 years, at least a portion of what it was that I've been researching, that I've been working on, and ultimately that I presented to my department for the fulfillment of the requirements for Doctor of Philosophy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The title of the dissertation was, Can You Lead About Leviathan with a Hook? This was not a title that I chose just because I liked how the word sounded. It's actually a reference to the biblical book of Job. For those of you who know the story of Job, he is described as a very good guy. He's supposed to be a very righteous person. He's supposed to be very moral. He lives a very good life. And one day, the devil comes to God and says, hey, I bet you Job wouldn't keep being a good person if you took away all the good stuff he has in his life. I bet he's only a good person because he is relatively wealthy. He has a good family that likes him. He hasn't had to deal with any major life issues. And God says, I'll take that bet. So Job's house burns to the ground, all his cattle run away, his crops get some kind of terrible disease, his children die. He ends up poor, destitute, with weeping boils on his skin. And so Job's friends come to him and say, Job, you're obviously a terrible person, or else God wouldn't have done this to you. And Job says, no, I don't know what's going on. I don't know why God would do this to me, but I've lived my life rightly. So it's not a punishment, and I just have to accept that I don't know why God would do this to me. And for pretty much the remainder of the book, Job's friends, and also his wife, continuously tell him, you did something wrong, admit to it, curse God, and then die. That's the encouragement he receives from his friends. Job maintains steadfastly his faith and says, no, I didn't do something to deserve punishment. I don't know why this is happening, but I accept God must have a reason. At the end of the book of Job, God appears to Job. And Job says, Lord, I have maintained my faith in you. Could you at least tell me why you did this to me? And this is how God responds. Who are you to contest with the Almighty? Were you there when I laid about the foundations of the earth? Can you command the mountains to rise? Can you command the rain from the heavens to fall? Could you lead about Leviathan with a hook? God's response to Job, if you are not as strong as I am, as powerful as I am, if you're not God, who are you to question me in what I do? And in that response of God to Job, we are presented with a very interesting question. When we think of God, there's a lot of different images that come to mind, many of which are supplied to us through the Bible, through the passages that we hear every Sunday. God is a shepherd. God is a loving father. God is a faithful spouse. God is a strong, mighty king. God is a humble, loving friend. The God of Job is not exactly like any of those images. So the question we're presented with is this, namely, is God this kind of being that we can relate to, that is humble, that is meek, that is loving? Or is God this infinitely strong, majestic, inapproachable being thundering from the fiery cloud upon Mount Sinai? We're given these two different pictures of God. How is it that we resolve the seemingly inconsistency between them? And in many ways, that was the question that my dissertation sought to answer through some historical comparative work, and then also through an application of that historical comparative work to contemporary scholarship. What I want to discuss tonight is less so how I applied the historical work I did to critique some contemporary scholars, and more so the root of the overall dissertation project. That question of whether or not we can resolve these two different pictures of God. The loving Father, the thundering voice hidden behind a cloud, ordering people to do things and punishing those that do not do things. So, setting the stage, so to speak, in that way, let's take a step back. What does it mean to be omnipotent, to be all-powerful? And once we've defined that, we'll then be able to ask the question more precisely, more exactly, how is it that we can try to reconcile a vision of an all-powerful God with these other biblical images? So, what does it mean to be all-powerful? Typically, when God is described in philosophical and theological language, both contemporarily but also within the larger historical Christian tradition, there is a focus given to what are called the divine attributes. All of you know what an attribute is, even in the philosophical sense of a word. If I were to say that one of you is tall, if I were to say that some of you are old, if I were to say that the majority of you are obviously young and energetic, all of these are attributes. When we speak of divine attributes, then, we're just talking about what God is like. And the Christian tradition has always held that the divine attributes are perfect. That is, God is different from us, not in that he has completely different traits, but rather in how he has those traits. So, there are humans that are like God to a certain extent. The wisdom of Solomon, God is described as wise. King Solomon is described as wise. The difference is just that God's wisdom is perfect and Solomon's is not. There are judges in the Old Testament described as just. God is described as just. The difference between the judges and God is that God's justice is perfect, whereas the judges failed in dispensing justice sometimes. We could go through other examples, but this is largely the point that needs to be made. When we talk about the divine perfections, we are talking about traits that God has, characteristics that God has, and how he has them, which is to say, in the best way, in the most perfect way. So omnipotence then. Omni is the prefix from the Latin for all or universal, and then potency, you know the English word. This is from the Latin potentia, meaning power. So, literal translation of the word, all-powerful. Omnipotence, then, is a description of how powerful God is. He is the most powerful you can be. The early medieval friar, Anselm of Canterbury, described God in this way. Anselm said God was the being the greater than which cannot be conceived, which is a very awkward translation of this. God is the greatest possible being. In other words, you cannot think of, you cannot conceive of someone that is better than God. So when we're talking about God's omnipotence, what we're really saying is that it is inconceivable for a being to be able to do something better than God does it. When I teach philosophy of religion in my classes, I will explain the divine attributes to my students in this way. I'll tell them, think of a comic book character. And, well, with all of the comic book movies that have been coming out, I'll usually be able to get an example or two relatively easily. And so you'll get Superman, who can fly or who has heat vision. Or you'll get Captain America or the Hulk. They're both very, very strong. Or you'll get the Flash, who's very fast. And I'll say, great. Now, can you think of a superhero that is better than? I'll use Superman. Well, Superman can do A, B, C, D, and E. Great. What if I gave you a superhero that could do A, B, C, D, and E, and then also this other thing? So I call him Superman Plus or more Superman. And then what if I had another superhero that could do everything more Superman could do, but then could also do something else? God is what happens when you've added literally every good thing that someone could do, and there are none left to add. So if we just have this structure of quote-unquote superheroes, where we give each one a new power the one before it doesn't have, the greatest possible superhero is the one that has all of the powers. There's none left to give. God is the being to which we can add nothing, the unimprovable being. Think of any good trait. God has that in the best way it can be had. You can't give anything to God he lacks, and God can't do any better with what he already has. So omnipotence, power. God is able to do, well, anything that anyone else can do, anything that we could think of anyone doing, and do it in the best way. In abstract, this definition makes sense. Unfortunately, this abstract definition very quickly becomes problematic. I'm sure you guys can think of examples why. Mary asked about one before the talk. Can God make a taco too spicy for him to eat? Father Paul, when he introduced this talk at one of the masses, brought up, I think it was a George Carlin bit, the rock that's too big for God to lift. Can God make a rock too big for God to lift? If you want to know how serious academic philosophy is sometimes, that George Carlin bit has multiple papers written about it. Like, I have read through those papers and read through responses to a comedy routine about whether or not God can make rocks too big. The point is, though, in abstract, the principle, God can do whatever it is that is good to do and do it in the best way, is relatively simple. The application of that is not very simple. To try and explain how we take this principle from speculative theology to actual practical principle, something that we can use to help us understand theological problems, we have to understand some historical context. If you were in my classes, you've grown at this point, because I say that phrase all the time, and then we end up on a historical tangent about a bunch of people who died 1,000 years ago for a very long time. But, well, that's what you get to hear now. So, if we go to roughly the 13th century in medieval Europe, there's a few different things going on. We're going to focus on one of these historical phenomenon. Interestingly enough, though Plato and Aristotle are pretty well-known names for anyone who knows anything about philosophy, even for those of you who didn't major in philosophy or maybe even never took a course in philosophy, you've probably heard those names. Those figures are not well known in medieval Europe for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. Why? Well, because the books that were either written by or at least attributed to Plato and Aristotle and their students are largely lost. The destruction of the library at Alexandria is one of the reasons why Viking raids on monasteries, when monks were among the few literate people in Europe, and monks were those who preserved ancient texts, are another reason why. There's a lot of historical reasons we could go into. The point is this: Aristotle, Plato, famous philosophers that they be, are not well known in medieval Europe. There's another reason for that. Most people don't read ancient Greek. Do you know who does read ancient Greek? Islamic scholars, Middle Eastern scholars. Middle Eastern scholars are also fluent in Latin, the language of the Roman Empire that medieval European priests do read. Islamic scholars read, translate, and comment on Plato and Aristotle. And then in the various wars that happened in medieval Europe, in the medieval period in general, these Latinized works are brought back into mainland Europe. And then the Christian West is able to read Plato and Aristotle for the first time in centuries, in well over 1,000 years. And then the Christian West has to figure something out. Plato and Aristotle say a lot of things that actually are very, very helpful to explaining Christianity as a religion. But Plato and Aristotle are not Christians. They exist a couple hundred years before Jesus did. Christianity didn't exist at that point. They're also pagans. Whether or not they believe in the full pantheon of Greek gods and goddesses is unimportant. They obviously don't believe in the Christian God, and they're not monotheistic. So on the one hand, Plato and Aristotle are helpful to Christianity. On the other hand, Plato and Aristotle pose a threat to the religious purity of the Christians who are reading them. So, what do? You may be sitting asking yourself right now, what does this have to do with omnipotence? Well, let me tell you. There are largely two schools in medieval philosophy, medieval Christian philosophy, with respect to God's omnipotence. And those two schools track to two different responses to the introduction or reintroduction of Plato and Aristotle into medieval Christian Europe. On the one hand, there is a group of scholars who fully embrace these Greek texts and think that it's great to have non-Christian scholars who can help better explain Christianity. And this group largely doesn't have a problem with teaching Plato and Aristotle within Christian universities, with universities largely being for priests with a few exceptions, at least at this time period. The other group is very, very critical of the study and the teaching of Plato and Aristotle because that group worries that this will lead to heresy, to religious unorthodoxy. Heterodoxy is the term. That it's going to lead to people believing in the wrong things and so ultimately going to hell, not going to heaven. The first group also happens to think that God's power is limited in some ways. The second group doesn't. I bring this up because I want to, within this entire presentation, highlight that we're not just talking about something that's abstract, that's speculative, that is ultimately an interesting question that doesn't matter to religious practice. Monks, well, they didn't involve themselves in pugilism over these questions, but they demanded people get kicked out of the church for them. They threatened excommunication to each other. They declared each other heretics because of these questions. This isn't some staid, purely academic question. Rather, this question has practical import. So, those who believe that we could teach Plato and Aristotle didn't have a problem with also saying, yeah, God's power is somewhat limited. Those who believed that it was okay to teach Plato and Aristotle, or excuse me, that believed it wasn't okay to teach Plato and Aristotle, said God's power wasn't limited at all. Why did they say that? Well, their motivation for saying that was because they didn't want God to have limits placed upon him. They wanted to protect this idea of God being sovereign, of God being free, of God being at liberty to shape the world as God wished to, not dependent on human designs, not dependent on human artifices, but rather, well, independent of everything save God's own will. There were theological motivations to answer this question one way rather than another, motivations related to questions of religious practice, questions of how to be a good Christian. So that's the historical context, at least, for the question that we're going to be examining. There's this existential angst of a kind in medieval Christianity. Can we read these people? Can we bring in non-Christian sources? How will this change our understanding of God? And what will changing our understanding of God do to our worship of God? And if we change how we worship God, are we threatening our souls? And are we threatening the souls of those that we in turn will teach who rely on us to understand the way to salvation? This isn't just academic. Okay, now let's talk about the academic part of omnipotence. There's two schools. One school holds God's power can be limited in some sense. The other school holds God's power is unlimited. What do they mean by this? And why, absent the religious motivation, do they say this? Questions about God's omnipotence are largely ultimately questions about what is possible for God to do. Everyone in the medieval period largely thought that God could do whatever was possible. What they disagreed about was what counted as possible, the scope or the range of possibility. So what do I mean by that? When we talk about possibility, we're normally not doing so in a strictly logical sense. Normally when we talk about possibility, we're doing so in a practical sense. What do I mean by that? If I were to ask you, is it possible for you as a human to fly? And no, I don't mean going on an airplane. I mean, you jump off a roof and you flap your arms and you stay in the air. You're probably going to say to me, no, that's practical possibility. Given how the world is right now, none of us are capable of unassisted flight. Logical possibility has to do with not just how the world is right now, but every different way in which the world could be. So, could humans have been able to fly? Sure. If we had evolved wings, if we were much, much smaller than we are right now, if we had hollow bones like birds, there's ways we could conceive of, we could think of humans being able to fly. That's just not how we are. So that's the difference between practical and logical possibility. So the medievals then disagreed as to first, which things counted as possible, and second, which kinds of possibility mattered when we talked about what God could do. For some of our medieval thinkers, when we say that God can do anything that is possible, we mean that in a very, very limited sense. There's not that much distance between logically possible, so things arranged in every different way they could be, and practically possible, things arranged as they are now. For our medieval thinkers, though, that thought God could do a bunch of things, there was a large amount of space between here's how the world is now and here's how God could have made the world. So the difference then in these visions of logical possibility, of practical possibility, helps separate out our different medieval thinkers, helps separate out why some thought that God could, in fact, do things that don't look to be possible, whereas others thought God couldn't do things that don't look to be possible. Let's revisit some of those earlier examples that I mentioned to make this a little more concrete, a little more manageable. So, the question of whether or not God could make a rock so big that he couldn't lift it. This is a question ultimately of logical or conceptual possibility. This is a question of whether God could do something that violates a basic law of logic. This isn't just, well, human beings didn't evolve with wings. This isn't just, well, leopards have brown? What color are leopards? I think they're tan and brown. Leopards are this color right now, but they could have been green if God made the world in a different way. We're not talking about changeable things. We'd call them contingent things in philosophy. We're rather talking about a fundamental rule of the universe. There's a difference between that example and an example like, could God lie? In this example, we're not asking, could God change a fundamental law or rule of the universe? We're instead asking, could God do something that seems to go against the kind of being that we know God to be? This further form of differentiation also helped distinguish our different schools of medieval thinkers. Only the most extreme medieval thinkers said that God could do something like ignore the law of non-contradiction, make rocks so big that he couldn't lift them, make tacos so spicy that he couldn't eat them. Why did they say this? Well, most medievals didn't say this because they didn't actually think they were taking anything away from God by saying God can't do this. Think about it this way. If I were to ask you, can you draw a square circle for me? Can you draw me an image of a shape that has a circumference where every point in the circumference is equidistant from the center, and also a shape that has 4 right angles? You couldn't do this. If I had a chalkboard behind me, I'd try and show you, but hopefully you can imagine this. Squares and circles aren't the same definitionally. You wouldn't say I'm a bad geometry teacher because I can't draw you a square circle. You would say it doesn't make sense. It is irrational to suppose I could construct that kind of a shape. So when I say that only the most extreme medieval thinkers said God could do something like make rocks so big he couldn't lift them, it's because of the ask there. This isn't a matter of, oh, if I had just, lifted 5 more pounds, I could pick up this bigger dumbbell. This is the universe functions such that this is not even a sensical. This is not even a logically legitimate question to pose. It's no different than asking, can God purple the giraffe? Can God square the onion? That doesn't make sense. Exactly. It's not something God could do. And so to say God can't do it isn't to say, oh, we got you, God can't do it. No, it's just not a thing. So there's nothing wrong with saying God can't do that. So let's go away from the most extreme medieval thinkers. Let's talk about what I termed in my dissertation the divine power absolutists. Those who thought that God could do a bunch of stuff that would normally not be allowed for God to do. So, if you posed to these thinkers the question, can God sin? They would answer, yes. God can tell a lie. God can order you to kill your child, Abraham. God can make it okay for you to kill your child Abraham, and then make it not okay to kill your child a few generations later, Israel. God can do these things that seem to violate a different rule, the moral rules that God has established, because, well, there's various explanations given by the divine power absolutists, but the point is, they don't want to place restrictions on the power of God. They think it is more important for God to be free to make the world and remake the world the way that he wants to, in comparison to saying, well, it looks to be bad based on how we assess good and bad for God to require this, or for God to tell us to do this, or for God to say that this is a good thing or a bad thing to do. So, when presented the choice between saying, well, it looks like God would not be perfectly good if he told us to do this, but it looks like God would not be perfectly free or perfectly powerful if he couldn't tell us to do this, the divine power absolutist will say, well, God's power is ultimately what makes him God. God's power is ultimately what allows him to be creator, to be the orderer of the world, to be the lawgiver for the world. And so that has to be the first thing that we understand, or that we incorporate into our understanding of God. And so any other questions, they are moved aside in some sense. The question of God's power takes precedence over them. In other words, if there's a conflict for the divine power absolutist between God's power and any other attribute of God, the divine power absolutist will always say, well, God can do by his power whatever the thing is. Moving then to the other end of our tradition, the divine power intellectualists, those who have a less expansive view of God's power. If you ask them, can God tell a lie? If you ask them, could God make a person identical to me in a different place as me who's also the same person as me? Will I still exist? They'd say, no, God can't do that. If you were to ask them, can God change the past? They'd say, no, God can't do that. There's a lot more examples I could give. The point is, they are going to shrink, so to speak. They are going to limit, so to speak, what God is able to do, what counts as being possible, not just for God, but for anyone to do. And if you were to ask one of these divine power intellectualists, well, doesn't that make your God not the most powerful being? Couldn't I think of a being more powerful than your God? They'd say, no. In the same way, it doesn't make sense to ask, can God draw a square circle? Can God square onions or purple giraffes? It doesn't make sense to ask if an all good, all loving, all merciful being would lie. It doesn't make sense to ask if a all-wise, all-knowing being would change the past. It doesn't make sense to ask whether a wise being that places us in the world so we can come to knowledge of that world and of him through that world would stick us in a world that deceived us, would make the world such that we could be confused by it because it's fundamentally unintelligible, it's fundamentally confusing. They would say that in understanding God's nature, we don't understand there's power over here and then everything else over here. We understand that all the different parts of God work together as one. The divine power intellectualists would actually say that all of these different attributes are not just unified but singular. That is to say, God's wisdom is his power, is his mercy, is his justice, and so on and so forth. They would say that no one attribute of God's, they would say that no one trait of God's conflicts with, fights with another. And so, we're not limiting God, we're not making it so that God is less powerful by saying, well, a wise God, a loving God, a good God wouldn't do this. We're just making God act consistently with who he is. We're just having God act in a way that follows from the kind of perfect being that he is. So these are sort of the different camps we could fall into. The divine power absolutists, who are interested for those religious reasons I outlined earlier in preserving God's power and freedom at all costs. And then the divine power intellectualists, who also for religious reasons, although separate religious reasons, are concerned with preserving this view of a unified, of a consistent God at all costs. And these generate for us then these different philosophical and theological ways of understanding the disparate biblical images that we talked about, that we encountered earlier. This is why you can have the Jobian God, Job, who are you to contest with the Almighty? I'll do whatever I want, and you're going to, well, grin and bear it, because I'm God and you're not. But then also have the image of the Good Shepherd who goes looking for the one sheep, despite having 99 of them safe in his flock. These images, they're not just a result from, well, biblical authors getting confused in their storytelling, or parables just not always having a clear message. They're also resultant from there being these different traditions within the wider Christian tradition that don't always nicely work together. Because yes, we can find examples of a merciful God in the Bible, and we can find examples of a demanding sovereign God in the Bible. And in the wider tradition, we can see different members of that tradition, different teachers in that tradition, giving us an understanding of God that tends more towards God's power, that tends more towards God's wisdom or God's goodness. So these different schools then, these different medieval schools that dedicate themselves to trying to preserve particular parts of a theological tradition, they're no different than all of the schools that came before them. This question of God's power then is in some ways a microcosm of this wider attempt of the Christian tradition to deal with our human inability to make sense of the infinite, to make sense of a being that is perfect when we are, well, imperfect in all senses of that word. I want to end tonight, because I think I've talked for long enough, with a revisiting of that consideration I raised earlier. Why does this speculative question of God's power matter at all? And I'd like to offer a few examples of why it does matter if you're a divine power absolutist or if you're a divine power intellectualist. So, why should we care whether God's power is limited? Why should we care what the bounds of possibility are with respect to divine action? Here's a couple of reasons. If you think it is important to preserve the power of God, so if you're a divine power absolutist, if you want to defend the idea that God could tell a lie, that God could make it so that child sacrifice is morally okay, you are committing yourself to a view known as divine command theory, a view in which God says, this is the moral law. It is defined by God, or commanded by God, hence the name. That view is problematic for many Christians. It abandons something that a lot of Christians want from their moral views, namely that they aren't changeable, that they aren't dependent on a singular being, on a singular person. Similarly, if you're a divine intellectualist, if you want to hold that all of the different attributes that make up God work together, are always in harmony, well, then you're going to run into problems where it seems like God is subject to something that isn't in himself, that's external to him. If you want to say it doesn't make sense to ask whether God can make square circles, or it doesn't make sense to ask whether God can change the past, well then I'm going to ask you, so God has to make sense? Is God bound to the laws of logic? Is God bound to laws of human reasoning? Because if he is, well, then it looks like there's God here and there's something above God. And that's not good because God's not supposed to be beneath or subject to anything else. The point is, there are in fact practical religious commitments that come along with these theoretical positions. And again, this isn't just relevant to omnipotence. We could talk about omniscience, God's knowledge. We could talk about omnibenevolence, God's goodness. A lot of the challenges that have been raised to Christianity historically have to do with these three different divine attributes and the practical religious commitments that come from adopting particular theoretical principles, particular theoretical stands as to how God's knowledge is perfect, how God's power is perfect, how God's goodness is perfect. What you do with the general principle affects how then you can respond to particular questions if you're going to remain consistent, if you're going to have a well-structured religious system, if you're going to have a well-structured belief system. So then, these theoretical considerations matter. We should care about whether God's power is in fact unlimited, whether God can in fact do anything, and what the word anything means in that context, because it's going to then alter the religious commitments that we have, the religious beliefs that we have, if we end up being honest with ourselves. If you want to have a Christianity in which God can change that it's wrong for adultery to occur, or that it's wrong for genocide to occur from one day to the next, okay, you need to justify for me why that's a good Christian God to believe in. If you want to have a Christianity in which we rather focus on these unchanging aspects of the divine, you need to explain to me how we figured out that portion of a God that is often described as something we can't understand, is often described as being removed from our human intellects. There are commitments to any principle that you adopt. And those commitments, in turn, are going to bring with them problems that you have to answer to if you care about having an intelligent and intelligible belief system. I'll close with another phrase my students would have heard many times before, and that they probably loathe me saying. Philosophy is not about finding a good answer to a question. It's about finding which answer to a question has the least number of problems and the least number of problems that are objectionable. So when we look at the question of whether or not God is all-powerful, I don't think there's a perfect answer to how we ought to define God's power. I do think instead the challenge to any Christian who cares about God, which, most Christians should, is this: which consequences of which position that you could take on God's power are acceptable to you? And more importantly, which consequences that you could take, or which consequences of which position you could take on God's power, are you willing to defend? If ultimately we're supposed to share God with those we encounter, we have to have an intelligible, reasonable, justifiable understanding of God to share. Which means we need to be able to explain, to some extent, what we mean when we say God is perfect. What we mean when among those perfections we include God's power. So, is God all-powerful? Well, that depends on what you mean by all-powerful. Can God do whatever he wants? Well, that depends on what you mean by whatever he wants. Can God do anything? Well, that depends on what you mean by anything. Here's the thing that matters. When you respond to those questions, you are taking on a burden of responding to the problems carried along with, what you are adopting, what you are accepting. That's not just a burden that comes along with, say, a religious belief. That's a burden that comes along with any belief that we might have about Things as simple as whether or not we think it's snowing outside, things that are more complex, whether or not we think a particular vaccine is effective or safe. These are all things that affect our lives. So then, remember this. The principles that we adopt, the principles that we accept, carry with them consequences. What you think about God's power does in fact affect how it is you should be explaining and you should be practicing your religiosity. So, the questions that I've posed, yes, they're abstract questions, but they matter practically too. And, as Father Pat always reminded me, the purpose of philosophy is not just to talk about the world, but to change it. So, in that spirit, try to answer the question, but also keep in mind what answering the question will then require of you. Thank you. If anyone has questions, there is a microphone that's going to be going around. Because we're live streaming, you need to talk into the microphone for the people who may be watching to hear you. So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and then the microphone will come to you.
Was there a specific name for the two schools of thought in the medieval period, or was it just the absolutionists and the intellectuals?
So the labels that I applied are used by some contemporary scholars, but they're imperfect and imprecise. We're talking about many, many, many people spread over hundreds and hundreds of years. So yes, divine power absolutist and divine power intellectualist, they're labels that some philosophers will be familiar with, but I wouldn't say that they're, required labels. I wouldn't say that they are canonical labels.
Can you give some examples, like where would St. Thomas come in on this question?
Sure. So Thomas is one of the divine power intellectualists. Thomas believes that to ask whether or not God could lie, whether or not God could change the past, whether or not God could alter moral rules in general, all of these questions miss the point, so to speak. He sees these in the same way as the question of whether or not we can make square circles, the question of whether or not we could make triangular circles, something like that, where these are just nonsensical questions. So Thomas holds to the view that all of God's attributes work together. They're harmonious, they're unified, they never conflict with each other.
And give me some names that we might know that would be on the other side.
The two figures that are most commonly associated with divine power absolutism would be John Duns Scotus and then William of Ockham. Another part of my dissertation project, though, and this might be helpful, was showing that divine power absolutism doesn't stop in the medieval period. It carries forward. I argued in the dissertation it carries forward to a bunch of names in the modern period we might be familiar with. So René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Isaac Newton, figures that we see as part of this scientific age and less often as apologists for, defenders of Christianity, all of them actually, at least I argued that they did, adopted a Christian divine power absolutist view because of those concerns that arose in medieval Europe. So it's not just something that is reserved to a bunch of monks fighting each other for a couple hundred years, from the 1200s to the 1400s, and then it goes away. This problem is maintained well after the medieval period, and it's something that the Enlightenment era, the scientific revolution era, figures in that era have a lot to say about it, and figures in that era, generally speaking, are going to adopt the divine power absolutist view. They're going to adopt that God's power is unlimited.
And in that era, what names might we know that would be more on the side of Thomas?
So the major figure would be Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. There's other figures that are less. There are other figures that are less well known. It also becomes a little bit tricky to try and divide people into the medieval camps because not everyone in the modern period knows Thomas. So there's more familiarity with the divine power absolutist authors and texts than there is with the tradition that came before it, which was the divine power intellectualist tradition.
And how about, say, today? Does it still, the debate goes on, and who might be on one side and who might be on another?
Yes. So actually, if you read some of the scholarly debate about whether or not God's omnipotent, you'll have both Christians fighting over this and then theists and atheists fighting over this. And one of the responses that will be given by theists to atheists, I'm thinking of one paper in particular, is written by J.L. Mackie. He's a fairly famous, both non-theist, but then also, well, he holds a particular ethical view that he's famous for, but that's unimportant for our current purposes. Mackie writes a paper in which he denies God is omnipotent, and then the Christian respondents to him say he misunderstands what omnipotence means, and they shrink the scope of omnipotence. That's one of the reasons why I say this has practical significance, because a lot of the responses that are given to persons who problematize omnipotence today is simply to say, oh no, when we say God's all-powerful, we don't mean he can do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, we just mean he can do X and Y. To which, of course, the response is, well, that's not really omnipotence. So defining omnipotence is hugely important, I would say, to the contemporary debates over whether God exists, whether God is like the Christian God today, as well as to the still existent intra-Christian debates over how it is we should conceive of an all-powerful God acting in the world.
And just one last question. The word Leviathan, how do you think it's used in Job? What does it mean?
So the references in Job is probably to a particular, I'll say a cultural understanding at the time, whereas the ancient Hebrews, they had a mythology. In the same way we talk about, say, Greek mythology, where you have Scylla and Charybdis in the Odyssey that Odysseus has to avoid. We talk about Norse mythology. There's a giant dragon wrapped around the tree that supports all of the realms that the Norse gods rule over. And at the end of time in Ragnarok, Thor will fight this particular god, and Heimdall will fight this particular god. The ancient Israelites, the Hebrews, had a mythology too. And in that mythology, the flat world had this great basin of water underneath it, and at the bottom of that basin was a giant monster they named Leviathan. So in the sense of both the references that the book of Job were making, as well as probably the cultural context of the time, it's just a big scary monster that lives at the bottom of the ocean. In the same way, Behemoth, which is also mentioned in the Old Testament, is just a big scary monster that lives on the land. Other questions?
I don't know if I'd be formulating this question correctly, but could one respond if someone objects to St. Thomas's view, like the intellectualist view of, then would, if God is contingent on logic being external, therefore being God contingent on logic, could one respond to saying that logic could be a divine attribute and therefore in conjunction with St. Thomas's view on divine simplicity, it's just God being kind of contingent on himself?
Yeah, so that it's a well-formulated question because that is the response that's given. So if you were to pose the problem to a divine intellectualist, if you're saying everything God does has to make sense or has to be harmonious, aren't you then saying God is being judged by or is being held up to the standard of harmony or of reasonableness? You could respond to that simply by saying these standards just exist in God. Because God is perfectly knowledgeable or perfectly wise, The standard of reason is a part of God himself. Because God is perfectly merciful or perfectly just, the standards of morality exist as a part of God. This is very much the standard response given by divine intellectualists. It's not a perfect response. There's two ways that generally one could counter-respond to this. First, well, how do we know all these fairly complicated parts of the divine being, of the divine nature? Thomas denies that we have direct knowledge of God's nature, and that's actually a pretty common denial of the medieval period. Thomas says we know God indirectly, we know God through other things in the world, and we say, well, I know that God is good, and here's something that's good, so God has to be kind of like this thing. That kind of indirect knowledge does not get us to the descriptive understanding of the laws of logic or the laws of reason or the laws of morality present in the divine nature. In other words, we have to ask how those laws would be intelligible to us, how we would know they were in God in the first place. If we're going to say we can avoid this problem of externalizing them, of subjecting God to an external standard by placing them in the divine nature. The second problem would simply be that to argue with whether or not this is an acceptable, whether or not this is a satisfactory solution. We could say that, well, place these things in the divine nature, that doesn't mean that we've eliminated any conflicts between all of the divine attributes. It still looks like justice and mercy do not coincide perfectly, even if the standards for justice and mercy are part of God. It still looks like what will be, in one sense, reasonable does restrict what God could have done if he didn't want to be reasonable, even if those standards are still a part of God. So the second response would simply be, you haven't fixed the problem, or you've introduced another problem by trying to fix the first problem.
Gotcha.
Any last questions? So the question is, what philosophers would come from this generation? What do I think their thoughts would be? So philosophy has been remarkably disunified for a very long time now. It's very hard in the moment to pick out who is going to be sort of the named philosopher for the 21st century, for this generation even. There's a lot to be said about this. We could talk about how philosophy has become hyper-specialized. So in physics, you could talk about Newton or you could talk about Einstein, but today there's 10,000 different people working on 10,000 different things in physics rather than one big theory. Philosophy has a similar problem. We could talk about how there's just a lot more philosophers today. So it's really hard to sort of stand out. It's really hard to sort of launch a way of thinking, a tradition. So there were Aristotelian philosophers, however many thousands of years ago, that Aristotle first had a school. There were Lockean philosophers after John Locke wrote his treatises. There were Humean philosophers and so on and so forth. But today, you have universities that have faculties with 20, 30 people on them, and each of those faculty members have students, and then those students have their own students. So it's hard to say, well, this one person's going to be influential in a way that will carry forward in history. So I don't really know what's going to stand out as a definitive or among the definitive philosophies for where we are today. And I don't even know if there's going to be a singular philosophy or even a set of philosophies that we can sort of pull out of this time in history. Going back to the mid-1900s, sure, there were things going on in the United States, but there's other parts of the world that do philosophy. So I don't know if really we could come up with this general philosophy or come up with members of this philosophical school and say they're going to be the ones that carry philosophy forward, so to speak, or they're going to be the ones that get remembered once we advance forward in history. In some ways, that's comforting because it leaves room for the quantum leaps, so to speak, the jumps forward we've seen philosophy make in the past. In other ways, that's very uncomforting because there's really big questions that need answers, and it doesn't seem like we're making much progress toward them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The last question?
Going back to your discussion on Aristotle and Plato, this might be a bit naive and perhaps a little too hypothetical, but is it possible to think that even though they were not at all Christian, that God could have had some sort of influence on their philosophy? And if that's the case, is it possible that that would have been taken into account by the intellectualists, or?
It's a very interesting question, and actually one that is very relevant to the Christian tradition's response to Plato and Aristotle. It's certainly been suggested within the Christian tradition that they were inspired somehow. Maybe not as directly as members of the Christian tradition believe the biblical authors were inspired, but they were in some ways shown something true about the world. So one of the Muslim writers that Thomas Aquinas quotes quite often has a phrase, "Truth doesn't contradict truth." If you get something right about the world, it doesn't matter where it's coming from, you got it right. So we could also just take that view on Plato and Aristotle. If you think Christianity is true, well, if they say some of the same things, they're getting the world right regardless of why they're getting it right. Coming from the perspective of someone who does historical work, there's a couple clarificatory things that I want to say because there's common misconceptions about Plato and Aristotle when it comes to the question of them prefiguring or foreshadowing Christianity. They do speak about a singular God. Aristotle has an argument for the existence of God that will actually become one of the most common arguments for God's existence. It's the first mover argument found in Thomas and other medieval Christians, found earlier or before them in medieval Islamic scholars who got it from Aristotle. Aristotle's God is not the Christian God, is also not the Jewish God. Aristotle does not have this sense, does not describe a personal God intervening in the world. If anything, Aristotle's God is a deistic God, the sort of clockmaker God talked about in the modern period. Makes the clock, puts all the pieces together, winds the clock, and then steps back and lets the pieces run, lets the clock run. So at least as Aristotle presents the argument, we don't have a God in history like Christianity does. Plato, through Socrates, and then also in places where scholars think Plato is just saying things he believes, using Socrates' name, Plato does not clearly endorse monotheism over polytheism. Socrates will talk about the Greek gods. Sometimes he'll deny their existence. Sometimes he will deny some of their existence. And sometimes he'll just suggest he thinks different gods than the Athenian gods exist. So with Plato, then, we don't even have a clear picture of monotheism. Plato, if we are able to construct accurately what he believed from his dialogues, most likely has the sense of what is known as a demiurge, a world spirit that exists at all times and sort of all things exist through it and that drives forward the progress of the world. So here we have something closer to a creator God that actually is involved with providentially his creation, but it's still a very, very Greek idea where you have these necessary laws of fate and fortune forming the world in particular ways. It's less so a God who puts forth a pillar of fire to keep Pharaoh's armies from encircling and killing the Israelites off. So there's still a sense of removal there. The other thing that I think is important to mention about both Plato and Aristotle with respect to the question of whether or not they could have been inspired, they say things that are pretty fundamental to their philosophies that cannot be reconciled with Christianity. It's why you have this historical problem in medieval philosophy about whether or not to use them in the first place. Because some of the stuff they say just doesn't work. And not just the arguments about God, but some of the philosophical principles that they adopt just cannot work within a Christian worldview. So when you add all this together, I don't think there's any problem with saying they could have gotten the same things right that Christian authors said. You could try to make the argument that they prefigure at least parts of Christianity, or they understand parts of what would later on become Christian doctrine, because Christianity most definitely builds upon especially Platonic ideas. So Augustine of Hippo, for example, when Augustine talks about his pre-Christian beliefs, he's talking about Manichaeanism. It's a heretical sect that is based on Neoplatonic ideas. When Thomas refers to Pseudo-Dionysius in the Summa Theologiae, Pseudo-Dionysius is, I believe, the second most quoted individual in the Summa. Pseudo-Dionysius is also a Neoplatonist author. So Christianity is certainly very much in this same strain of thought, in this same way of thinking. But then we just have to ask a question about the causality. Is that because Plato and Aristotle were formed by God somehow to write in this way, and then the Christians came along and continued that? Or was how Christian doctrine developed first altered, or maybe not altered, but prompted by these pre-existing cultural ways of thinking, by these pre-existing philosophical schools? So the short answer to your question, it's not impossible. There are some problems that exist with, as you phrased it, the naive claim that they were just directly inspired. There's definitely strong relationships, though, that exist between especially the early church and how it thought of God, how it formed its theology, though, and the Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a very good